Good morning. Today we're going to talk about the causes of the Great Depression and the early years of the Great Depression under Herbert Hoover. So I have here on my PowerPoint 6 key causes of the Great Depression. There was not one single cause, but the 1920s was a period of time of nearly unprecedented economic growth. If you remember all the consumer products, the cars, people buying homes, people buying other consumer goods for their houses, going to the movies in greater numbers. And a lot of people were financing their spending by buying on installment, by buying on credit. So if you can see number 4, overbuying on credit, it was just one of the many causes of the Great Depression. But whenever we tend to think about the Great Depression, we think about Black Tuesday, we think about the stock market crashing. The stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. It may have precipitated the Great Depression, which means it made it happen quicker. But there were so many underlying causes of the Great Depression, things that were brewing beneath the surface, that the stock market crash just kind of becomes the face of the Great Depression, but is not the only cause. Stock market crash itself, because of speculation buying, people are watching prices of different stocks go up and up and up and up, and that fear here is if I don't buy it now, that price is going to get so high that I won't be able to afford it any longer. And so they buy stocks without really considering if that stock might be overvalued. And so eventually the market bubble bursts and prices crash back down to reality. But people had so much. When I say people, I'm talking about 2% among America's wealthiest people have a lot of their money invested. When that market bubble bursts, many of them either lose their life savings or lose a great deal of what they had put into the market. Margin buying we'll get into here in a few slides just to kind of break down what it was. But if there is one way that you can actually lose money investing in the stock market is by margin buying. Number 2, banks are running out of money. A lot of banks had their money in the stock market, and so when the market crashes, a lot of banks lose their money. Banks were not FDIC insured at this time, so when people hear about the crash, they panic, they run to the banks, they call these bank runs, and they try to withdraw their savings. And so banks eventually run out of money, and because they're not insured by the government, once the money is gone from the bank, that bank is done. 3, a decline in foreign trade. You're going to see that the American government passes a tariff called the Hawley-Smoot tariff, intending to try to help American business. But what it does is it actually causes other European countries to reciprocate to tariffs. And what that does is it slows down foreign trade, period. So when you only have the market in America to sell your goods to, that's a small market in comparison to the entirety of the world. So that's another cause. Overbuying on credit. We'll get to. Farm prices are declining. During World War I, if you recall, farmers were doing extraordinarily well because Europe was embroiled in war. But in the 1920s, European farmers are back in business. So American farmers they have more competition, which leads to prices dropping. And so because farmers and people working in agriculture represent a large percentage of the American population, without their buying power and with their reliance on credit from the banks, that's going to be another cause of the depression. And an unequal distribution of wealth. You've heard that expression, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Well, because you have the working class, and just for the record, the working class, middle class, their wages are going up in the 20s. But there's only so much money out there to buy your refrigerators and your washing machines and your cars. A lot of them have to buy things on credit. And again, going back to number 4, overbuying on credit leads to some problems when the market crashes. People are going to call in their debts. People don't have the cash to pay for them, and you have a huge problem on your hands. All right, 1920s was an era, was what we consider to be a bull market with the stock market. It's a market with an upward trend in prices. So bull markets are good for investors because if I put money in, there's a pretty good chance that my money is not only going to gain a few, but maybe many percentage points here. So I'm going to get a good interest rate. It's a good time to invest. So people are putting their money, pumping their money into the market. The stock market in 2020, 21 here, with the exception of the crash in March and April of 2020, the market in 2021 is also a bull market. It's a good time to invest, but I guess the issue that investors have had historically speaking is you don't know when the bull market is going to end. The opposite of a bull market is a bear market. So a bear market is a market with a downward trend in prices. The 1920s saw a huge bull market run. In the 1930s, you're going to see a bear market where the prices do not go up very quickly and the market remains fairly stagnant. Speculation buying, what we mentioned earlier, this is the one way that people were getting caught up in the frenzy of people buying stocks. They're buying stocks low and selling them quickly for a fast profit. And again, that artificially can inflate or lower the price depending, as you can see on this graphic here, the stock market roller coaster. People are riding the wave. They don't really realize that eventually that wave could collapse and you have a crash. In this case, you got the roller coaster about to go over the cliff. So this product prices, the stock prices are kept artificially high by speculation. Other cause of the Great Depression are margin buying. Traditionally, if you invest money in the stock market, you can only lose as much as you invest. One of the only ways that you can lose more than what you invest is if you buy on margin. So what this is you're paying a broker, you're paying somebody a down payment, and what they're doing is they're loaning you money to invest in the stock market. So in this case here, margin buying, paying a small percentage of a stock's price as a down payment and borrowing the rest from, just think of the broker as a person. And this is fine as long as the bull market continues. So I buy a share of stock on margin. I get the money, the stock itself doubles in price. I have plenty of money to pay back the broker plus the interest that I owe the broker, and I have enough left over to make a nice hefty profit. When the market crashes, though, I bought those shares of stock. The stock price drops greatly. The margin buyer, the investor, the person that loaned me the money to buy on margin, is going to ask me for the money that I owe him. I don't have that money, so I have to pay him a fraction of what I owe him, and the stock that I owe him as well. And the stock is now relatively worthless, so the brokers are forced to sell that stock at a loss. So not only did I lose money, but the broker loses money, and it's a ripple effect. Banks had lent a lot of their cash reserve to brokers. So banks, by law, are supposed to have a certain amount of their money in the bank so that people would need to come and get their deposit. That money is there for them. Well, the good times were rolling in the 1920s, and people weren't necessarily thinking about what if. And so many banks had lend their money out to these brokers to lend money out on margin. And so the brokers, when they lose their money, they don't have the money to pay back the banks, and the banks are the source of money. There is no FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which comes around during the Great Depression, which we'll talk about another day here. So if the banks are losing money, then obviously they don't have enough money to loan out to people, so credit gets tighter. If people don't have access to credit, they don't have access to buy things like washing machines, cars, homes, etc. That ripple effect continues. Also, too, in the 1920s, people are buying durable goods in large numbers. Radios, refrigerators, cars are examples. You don't buy a refrigerator expecting to have to buy one again in 6 months. You don't buy a car expecting to have to buy one again in a year. These are things that you buy that you keep for the long term. So warehouses begin to fill up with durable goods. There's no market for these goods. And if I'm a manufacturer and I'm producing, say, refrigerators, well, that warehouse fills up with refrigerators. People aren't buying the way that they used to. There's no point in me continuing to employ the people that manufacture these refrigerators, so I begin to lay workers off. So there's a lot of things happening here in the 1920s, and by 1929, you have this perfect storm of things that are brewing, and then that stock market crash just kind of opened the floodgates. All right, overextension of credit. There's about $73 billion in credit out there that people had purchased goods on, only about $3.64 billion in actual cash in circulation. So when creditors called in the money that they were owed to the people that owed money to the creditors, they didn't have the cash out there to pay them. So Black Tuesday is, again, the stock market crash, October 29, 1929. Brokers then contact the margin investors, the people that loaned out their money to the average consumer. They don't have the money. The investors don't have the money, so brokers are forced to sell that stock at a loss. And before you know it, panic is setting in. You see here, a lot of people had their life fortune on paper, so everything that they had was tied up in the stock market. You can see this newspaper headline here, Wall Street in panic as stock crashes. And the next headline is attempt made to kill Italian Crown Prince. I assume that those two are not related. The top picture here, I don't know cars. I think this could be a Rolls Royce. $100 will buy this car, must have cash, lost all in the stock market. So people are selling, this man here selling this luxury car for a very small amount of money just because they need cash, because they have nothing. Everything was tied up in the market. You can see the picture of Wall Street here, panicked investors rushing to try to salvage what they can of their investments. The aftermath of the stock market crashing. In September of 1929, the stock market was at 381 points. Today in 2021, the stock market's at 30,000 points. Just to kind of give you an indicator. It's not dollars. It's just points. It's a weighted system. It's very confusing. We won't get into that. But the stock market's at 381, in September of 29. By July of 1932, the market crashed down all the way to 41 points. So it's down a substantial amount. You can see the graph here throughout the 1920s. By about 1924, 25, the market begins its upward trend. Again, it's never permanently up. There's ebbs and flows, but the overall trajectory is up, up, up. And you can see that by 1928, 29, the market is just furiously charging forward. And when the market initially crashes here, it goes back to where it was in 1928. So not all is not lost here, but buying stocks, the value of the stock market, the performance of the stock market, it's based on faith in where we're going as an economy. And there are a lot of people, as businesses start to shut down, as workers start to get laid off, and banks are starting to fail, they're not feeling too comfortable with investing their money. So you can see that there's a short-term upward trend in prices again. But then as 1930 hits, throughout the decade of throughout the early part of 1930s, the market just continually goes down and down and down and down until it hits 41. All right, just to give you some illustrations here. Bank failures. In 1932, by 1932, 11,000 out of the 25,000 banks in the United States are bust. They're done. So almost half the banks in the country have failed. Failed businesses. 1929, you have 23,000. By 1932, you have 32,000. So there's just tens of thousands of businesses in this country that are failing. Average annual income. This is a number that typically goes up, but the average annual income goes down from 1929 to 1932. And we use 1932, 1933 as benchmarks because that was the worst part of the Great Depression. The unemployment rate in 1929 was 3%. By 1932, it is at 25%. So 1/4 of America's population was out of work. And that doesn't even include the number of people who were underemployed or employed part-time or who had taken a pay cut to keep the job. So this is substantial. Even at the height of the stock market crash year, April 2020 into the summer, the unemployment rate went to about 14%, which is catastrophic. But 25% is just unheard of. It's the highest unemployment rate that we've ever had in the United States. Gross domestic product, this is the value of all goods and services produced in the U.S., $104 billion in 1929. By 1933, it had fallen almost in half to $59 billion. 400,000 farms were foreclosed upon in 1929 to 32. And it's not as if when these farms get foreclosed upon, these people can just go to the city and get a manufacturing job. This means that for many, all is lost. That Hawley-Smoot tariff just exacerbated the problem. It was designed to try to protect American businesses, but it had a crushing effect because we put tariffs on European goods. Well, guess what Europe does? Europe puts tariffs on American goods, and before you know it, trade halts. So the economy has come to a standstill. You see bread lines, you see soup lines. This one here is a pretty glaring illustration of how bad things were. People waiting, for hours and hours and hours, either for a bowl of soup or for some bread or for some hot coffee or donuts. And this is all paid for by state and local governments. And by the early 1930s, state and local governments were pretty much tapped out. So let's go to the political side of things here from the early part of the Great Depression. You have President Herbert Hoover. President Hoover was the most popular politician of his day in the 1920s. He came to power in 1928. He was elected in 1928 in a landslide. So March 4th, 1929, he takes office. And there are already signs that the economy is in trouble, but the stock market itself is still approaching all-time highs. When the Depression hits, Herbert Hoover here asks businessmen not to cut wages or production. Just keep paying your workers what you normally pay them. Keep producing the amount of goods that you would normally produce. We'll get out of this quickly. The business owners do listen. They do what they can for the short period of time here, but it's impossible to do what Hoover asks long term because there just isn't the money to do that. So in the 1930 here, you start to see people being laid off in great numbers. Businesses begin to shut down in large numbers. The belief here in Herbert Hoover and the Republican had this orthodoxy about laissez-faire economics, that individuals and charities should get people through hard times, not the federal government. That the business of America is business, and that business will flourish with less government involvement if the government starts stepping up to hand things out to people, like welfare, for instance, that you're going to make people dependent on the government. So he believes this is a short-term issue and that the market will work itself out. There are some attempts that Hoover makes to try to use the federal government to help with people out of depression. The Agricultural Marketing Act buys surplus products from farmers, so farmers only sell 80% of the products that they grow. The government would buy the other 20%. The Hawley-Smoot tariff, which we saw backfired because it ended up hurting American businesses more than anything. By 1932, you had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which we'll get to in 1 minute. All right, 1930, 31, 32, shanty towns start popping up all over the United States. People who were kicked out of their homes, had them foreclosed upon, were building homes out of whatever they could, discarded wood, cardboard. They called these Hoovervilles. So living in a Hooverville means you're living in a poverty encampment. Newspapers are called Hoover blankets because so many people were sleeping on park benches or sleeping outside that they had to use the newspapers for warmth. Empty pockets were called Hoover flags, meaning you have no money in your pocket, so you go into your pocket to pull money out, and there's nothing in there. In 1930, the midterm elections in the Senate and the House of Representatives, the Republicans get creamed, and if you remember in 1920s, it's an era of Republican dominance. 1930, the Democrats make a huge comeback, and by 1932, the Senate, the House, and the presidency are all in the hands of Democrats. This is a picture of Central Park, a Hooverville beginning to form here in early 1930s. It's a picture from an industrial town of a massive Hooverville, and you can see in the background, some larger buildings, some smokestacks. So obviously an industrial town, but these Hoovervilles are popping up all over the United States. And while the Depression itself was not Herbert Hoover's fault per se, his reaction to it was a little bit tepid. It was a reaction a lot of Americans would have preferred to see more of a strong action by the federal government to try to lift them out of the Depression. He does lead to the passage of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This doesn't give money to people per se, like in 2020 and 2021, the stimulus checks that came to individual Americans to use. This money goes to institutions like banks, insurance companies, railroads, to try to grease the wheels, to try to get the larger mechanisms in our country, liquid again, having money so they could, banks, for instance, could start to loan money out to people again. The theory was that this would create more jobs. Unfortunately, it was kind of too little too late. It didn't stimulate the economy quick enough. What was really the nail in the coffin for Herbert Hoover's presidency, if you remember from World War I, one of the incentives to fight in the war was to get your bonus by 1945. A lot of the people who were hardest hit by the Great Depression were World War I veterans. And so starting from Portland, Oregon in 1932, there was a march across the country in the spring of 1932. And World War I veterans from all over, not just Portland, but from all over the country, joined their march towards Washington. A lot of them brought their children with them. They brought their wives with them. You have about 17,000 shacks set up in the Anacostia Flats outside in Washington, D.C. You can see the Capitol building in the background. So you have this huge encampment of angry World War I veterans that are seeking their bonus pensions early, 13 years early to be exact. Congress voted not to give them their pensions early. They did not disperse. They still stayed in this encampment. And by July, Herbert Hoover's getting nervous. There's fear that these World War I veterans could spark a revolution in our country because the economy is in such bad shape. He orders Douglas MacArthur, who's head of the military, to go in to flush these people out. Not violently, however, it quickly turns chaotic. And if you can see, this is what, a picture of what the bonus army encampment would have looked like. And this is what happens after MacArthur and the army come in. They use tear gas, they torch buildings, and you can see here in the background here, you got the Capitol building. People don't die in this, but if you look at the pictures, it just looks terrible. World War I veterans, people who sacrificed some of the best years of their lives to try to help America win during the war. This is how they're repaid to try to get their bonuses early. It's not good optics for Herbert Hoover. If you look at the election in 1932, you get Franklin Roosevelt, absolutely dominating the Electoral College, winning a vast majority of the country. So by 1932, Herbert Hoover's done. Franklin Roosevelt is going to be the president from 1933 till 1945. He's the only president in American history to serve more than 2 terms. He's actually elected to 4 terms. But he's going to come to power in the United States March 4th, 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, or if you want to call it the depths of the Great Depression. And Americans are looking for action. They're looking for their federal government to do more than what the Hoover administration did. There's great fear, there's great panic of where the country is going from here. So we'll see in the next PowerPoint how he does.